Okay, continuing along here. Uh, Point 8, extinction threats from habitat loss and degradation. Okay, and again, this is really, we're going through a series of things that lead to destruction of wildlife and loss of biodiversity and so forth. All right, so think of this as more as the direct causes. The indirect cause, of course, is human population growth again. But what do humans do? They lead to habitat loss through destruction, as we've been mentioning. So this is the most important direct cause of loss of biodiversity. Okay, and again, looking at an example here, this is Central America, and it just shows you from 1950 to 1985 loss of wild areas in these countries. A lot of this had to do with expansion of farming, especially cattle. And you can tie this directly to the American, a lot of it to the American fast food industry. This is where the beef was grown. And this really leveled off in about 85 as conservation efforts picked up, particularly in Costa Rica, that we'll talk more about in a few minutes. Okay, so what about habitat loss? You can look at this in terms of degradation and fragmentation. So if we look at figure 21, this shows this patchwork of rainforest that in Brazil. And this is clear cutting, and you can see these little islands of remnant patches. This is actually an experiment. Corporations were going to cut this down anyway, but there was an agreement to study the effect of patch size on biodiversity. So you can see this nice little remnant square and a larger square here. Here we see more of a longer cross-like patch. And this is actually an experiment, sort of a tragic experiment, but one to gather data, because questions often arise. If you're going to preserve land, what's the best way to do it? Do you have many small patches or one large patch, and so forth? So we're going to talk a little bit about the effect of fragmentation and problems related to this. So let's just get through the notes first, and I'll review these slides. So fragmentation occurs when large continuous areas are divided into a patchwork of smaller areas. Problems: a decrease in population size, that means population of both plants and animals, and an increased surface area makes some species more vulnerable to predators, competition from non-native species, wind and fire, and then creation of barriers to migration, colonization, or obtaining mates. And we're going to focus on this surface area, increased surface area issue. And you can see that here. An important ramification of fragmentation is the creation of edges. Edges, of course, are on the outside of a patch, and we're looking here at the percentage of patch influenced by edges. Edges are bad because this is where wind, outside weedy species tend to chew up the edge, and it tends to be a relatively fixed area around a patch. So you can imagine going to the edge of a forest and you'd see edge effects, say, up to 50 meters into the edge. And this area is where you lose a lot of biodiversity, and you think of thorns and thickets and that sort of thing. The smaller the patch, and here's the key, the smaller the patch, the greater the relative area of the edge is. So you can see this large patch has 30% edge. When you get down to a smaller patch, it's almost all edge. So in effect, when a patch is too small, the interior will, there is no interior. It is just all edge. So larger patches are better than smaller patches in terms of conservation efforts. And again, this is what we call the edge effect. Okay, so that's degradation, fragmentation. Look at another slide here. This is actually, you can see this. This is a Google satellite shot of Home Depot on State Street. And next time you go there, look up on the edges, and you can actually see the effect of, well, you can see the edge effect. You'll see that trees are collapsed along the edge. Now, this isn't because of just, when they cut the parking lot out. This is additional damage done because of just this edge of this rather old forest is exposed to wind, and you'll see trees toppled and this mess along the edge of that area. So you can see that right in New Albany. Okay, role of genetic diversity. So these are, again, we're talking about extinction threats from habitat loss. Again, direct loss of habitat is important. Uh, the way it's fragmented is important. It leads to fragmentation and additional problems. And again, when we fragment the habitat and reduce habitat size, there's an impact on genetic diversity. And we've said over and over and over again how important genetic variation is into maintaining plants and animals and preventing extinction. So loss of genetic diversity limits the ability of populations to change and adapt to changing conditions. Okay, and we talked about in the past, there are two main effects of um, population size. One was a founder effect, okay, and this is where a new population is founded by a few individuals. And recall that leads to lower genetic variation. When you have a small population, you also get inbreeding, which results in accumulation of bad genes. Now, we did not go into that much, but we'll just take that as a fact because it's a rather difficult subject, inbreeding. Okay. Another effect when you have small population is a genetic bottleneck. And this is the most important um, influence on genetic diversity in terms of conservation biology. So again, these other things were related to, if you recall, we were talking about the subject of genetic drift, okay, which is a random change in allele frequencies. And we said that's important in small populations. And the question was, how does a population become small? Again, a founder effect, which leads to inbreeding and so forth. But here, our primary concern for conservation biology is the bottleneck effect. This occurs when a few individuals survive a catastrophe. Okay, so when we cut down forests, when we reduce the size of wild habitat, we are creating a genetic bottleneck. Okay, we're reducing population size. This then leads to inbreeding, reduced genetic diversity, and then ultimately what eliminates species is natural selection, which we'll take out, as I said in class today. You have low genetic variation, you have problems. Natural selection will then lead to extinction. So again, genetic drift via a population bottleneck reduces genetic variation, leading to natural selection, eliminating populations. I talked about grizzly bear today, and I won't say much here, but again, it's been reduced to small patches. Population geneticists view it, it's basically doomed. Okay, and so the question is, do you want to spend more money on a doomed situation? And we probably will, but we could debate that. Uh, Proposals, someone mentioned today zoos. Zoos can be very important these days, and in terms of exchanging individuals, and that's all about maintaining genetic variation. So zoos very carefully exchange individuals. Now, we're not talking about grizzly bears here, but other animals in particular. Zoos can play a big role in helping maintain the last remnants of genetic variation. Okay, without this, and I got here slow march to homozygosity, and again, saying a population is becoming homozygous, like Cap A, is the same thing as saying reduced genetic variation. In other words, all the alleles become the same at each loci, meaning homozygous, and that's what happens. Okay. Uh, we talked today about why save the grizzly. Uh, you know, it may be futile, but why not try? Some people would say. There's a video here. I don't know if this link is still active or not, but you on your own could find information about the black-footed ferret. This is a species that was down to about 20 animals left in existence, and it was rescued out of the wild and put in zoos. And they carefully bred individuals trying to maintain as much genetic variation as possible. And this video is about reintroduction of black-footed ferret. If this link isn't live, you could find one easily. Okay, so that is habitat loss and degradation. Okay, both direct losses through habitat loss and the indirect effects of reduced genetic variation. Another factor that reduces species is invasive species. Sometimes these are called introduced species or whatever. but this is accidental or deliberate introduction of species from another land. How do they get here? Aircraft, ballast water and ships, imported goods, and so forth. This is huge. Some people think this is as important as destruction of habitat. Now, we're still going to keep destruction of habitat as number one, but certainly closely followed by invasive species. We have over 50,000 introduced species in the United States. There's some dollar figures on what they cost. And really what they do is, and you see this on TV all the time, where volunteers are going out cutting down weeds and shrubs in critical habitats and so forth. Um, Here's a startling figure. 49% of our endangered species are really endangered because they are being outcompeted by non-native species. So there's this growing concern about the importance of introduced species. And there are a lot of really neat examples here of introduced species. Caught up here. Okay, some examples. Fire ant. Let me check my time here. Okay, I'm going to stop right now. This will be the end of segment 2.